the desert sun beat down mercilessly on the corrugated metal roof of the abandoned industrial yard, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon where sand met sky. Among the mountains of discarded machinery, rusted pipes, and forgotten equipment that stretched across 5 acres of sun-baked earth, an old prospector named Samuel Brennan moved slowly between the towering piles of scrap metal. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of searching for precious metals in the unforgiving landscape of Nevada, ran along the surfaces of various pieces, feeling for weight, testing for composition, looking for anything that might yield a few dollars at the recycling center in town. Samuel had spent 43 years working the remote corners of the American Southwest, first as a hopeful gold miner in his youth, then as a practical scrap collector in his later years. His truck, a battered Ford that had seen better decades, sat parked near the entrance of the yard, its bed already half filled with copper wire, aluminum sheeting, and various metal objects he had collected that morning. The yard belonged to no one anymore, or at least no one who cared enough to post signs or maintain fences. It had been abandoned sometime in the early 1990s when the military contractor that operated it went bankrupt, leaving behind decades of accumulated machinery and equipment that slowly rusted under the relentless Nevada sun. The discovery happened in the most mundane way possible, without fanfare or premonition. Samuel had been working his way through a section of the yard he had explored dozens of times before, but this time something caught his eye. A tarp, faded to almost white by years of sun exposure, covering something massive near the back corner of the property. He had noticed it before, but had always assumed it covered nothing more than a pile of worthless debris. Yet on this particular morning, driven by curiosity or perhaps just boredom, he decided to investigate. Now, we're getting close to something incredible here, just like we're approaching 7,000 subscribers on this channel. If you're enjoying this story of hidden history and amazing discoveries, hit that subscribe button and help us reach that milestone. And if you're really loving the content, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us bring you more fascinating stories like this one. Also, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, Europe, South America, or somewhere else entirely? We love hearing from our global community. Pulling back the tarp proved more difficult than Samuel had anticipated. The fabric had partially fused with the metal beneath it, merged by years of temperature extremes and chemical decomposition. He worked carefully, not wanting to tear the aged material unnecessarily, finally managing to fold it back section by section. What emerged from beneath that protective covering would have seemed worthless to most people. A hulking mass of rust-covered metal, roughly the size of a small car, with pipes protruding at odd angles and what appeared to be a large cylindrical chamber at its center. To the untrained eye, it looked like nothing more than an old industrial motor, perhaps from a generator or a large pump, the kind of equipment that had been common in mid-century manufacturing facilities. The rust coating was so complete that no original paint color remained visible, and the metal itself had taken on that distinctive reddish-brown patina that spoke of decades of oxidation. Yet something about it caught Samuel's attention in a way that other pieces of scrap had not. The construction seemed unusually robust, with massive bolts holding sections together and what appeared to be high-quality steel beneath the corrosion. Samuel circled the machine slowly, taking in its dimensions and construction. It measured approximately 12 feet in length and perhaps 5 feet in diameter at its widest point. The weight alone would make removal challenging. He estimated it at several tons at minimum. Yet despite the rust, despite the apparent age, there was something about the craftsmanship that suggested this had been an important piece of equipment in its day. The precision of the machining, visible even beneath the corrosion, indicated engineering of a high order. He knelt beside one end of the machine, pulling a wire brush from his tool belt and scraping away at a small section of the rust. The metal beneath proved to be substantial, thick steel plate that had been formed and welded with considerable skill. As he worked, something else emerged from beneath the oxidation layer: markings. Faint, barely visible, but definitely there. He applied more pressure with the brush, working systematically across a section roughly the size of his palm. Letters began to emerge, stamped into the metal surface rather than merely painted on. Samuel retrieved a water bottle from his pack and poured it over the area he had been working, washing away the loose rust particles. The letters became clearer. Partial words, numbers, what appeared to be a manufacturer's designation. He could make out fragments, elec, followed by what might have been boat, and below that, a string of numbers beginning with SS. His heart rate increased slightly, though he kept his excitement in check. Samuel had learned long ago not to get his hopes up over potential discoveries. The desert was full of abandoned equipment, and most of it proved to be exactly what it appeared, worthless junk. Yet something about these markings suggested military origin, and military surplus, even in deteriorated condition, often commanded better prices than standard industrial scrap. He spent the next hour working systematically around the machine, clearing away rust in strategic locations, looking for more identifying marks, trying to understand what exactly he had found. On the opposite end, he uncovered what appeared to be a manufacturer's plate, though so corroded that only fragments remained legible. He could make out Manu, and below that 19, followed by what might have been a 4 or a 9. The date marking suggested wartime production, somewhere in the 1940s. The more Samuel examined the machine, the more convinced he became that this was not ordinary industrial equipment. The construction techniques, the materials used, the specific configuration of the components, all of it pointed toward specialized military engineering. He had encountered enough military surplus over the years to recognize certain characteristics, and this piece had them in abundance. The question was whether it held any significant historical value or whether it was simply old military scrap. Samuel made his decision. Regardless of what the machine actually was, the quality of the metal alone made it worth hauling away. He would need help, of course, something this heavy required equipment he did not possess. But he knew people, scrappers and equipment operators who owed him favors or who might be interested in a percentage of whatever the machine brought at the recycling center. He carefully replaced the tarp, securing it as well as he could, and made his way back to his truck. The drive back to town gave Samuel time to think about the logistics of removal and transportation. He would need a flatbed truck, a crane, or at minimum a heavy-duty winch system, and probably 2 or 3 additional people to help with the operation. The yard was accessible enough. The gates had long since fallen off their hinges, and the access road, though rough, could accommodate a larger vehicle. The challenge would be getting the machine loaded without damaging it or, more importantly, without injuring anyone in the process. Back in his small workshop on the outskirts of Tonopah, Samuel made phone calls. First to Danny Rodriguez, who owned a towing and recovery service and had access to a flatbed truck with a crane. Then to Marcus Webb, a fellow scrapper who had helped on previous large-scale retrieval operations. Both men were interested, particularly when Samuel mentioned the size and apparent quality of the metal. They agreed to meet at the yard the following morning, weather permitting. That evening, Samuel found himself unable to stop thinking about the machine. Something about it had captured his imagination in a way that simple scrap metal normally did not. He pulled out his laptop, old and slow but functional, and began searching online for information about military motors from the World War II era. The search proved frustrating. There were thousands of different types of engines, generators, and motors produced during the war, and without more specific information, narrowing down exactly what he had found seemed impossible. He tried searching for the partial markings he had uncovered, elec boat, combined with SS, and numbers from the 1940s. The search results surprised him. Electric Boat Company appeared repeatedly, identified as one of the primary submarine manufacturers for the United States Navy during World War II. The SS designation, he learned, stood for Submarine Diesel Electric, the standard designation for submarines of that era. Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the computer screen. Could he have stumbled upon an actual submarine engine? The possibility seemed almost absurd, yet the more he considered it, the more it made sense. The size was right. Submarine diesel engines of that era were massive machines, designed to drive vessels displacing thousands of tons through ocean waters. The robust construction, the precision engineering, the quality of materials, all of it aligned with what would be required for naval service. But how would a submarine engine end up in an abandoned scrapyard in the middle of the Nevada desert, hundreds of miles from any ocean? Samuel knew that military equipment often traveled far from its original deployment locations, particularly when it was being surplused or scrapped. The base nearest to the yard had been a naval ammunition depot during the war, one of several inland facilities where munitions were stored and distributed. It was not inconceivable that surplus naval equipment might have ended up there. Sleep came slowly that night, Samuel's mind racing through possibilities. If the machine truly was a submarine engine, and if he could document its provenance, it might be worth far more than simple scrap value. Museums collected such artifacts. Historical societies preserved them. Even private collectors paid substantial sums for significant military equipment with verifiable histories. But all of that depended on being able to identify the engine specifically, to connect it to a particular vessel or program. The next morning arrived clear and hot, typical for Nevada in late summer. Samuel met Danny and Marcus at a truck stop on the edge of town, and the three men caravanned out to the abandoned yard. The flatbed truck, an aging Peterbilt with a mounted crane, negotiated the access road carefully, Danny navigating around the worst of the potholes and erosion channels that crisscrossed the approach. At the yard, Samuel led them to the tarp-covered machine. When he pulled back the covering, both men stood silently for a moment, taking in the size and condition of the find. Marcus whistled low, walking around the perimeter, assessing the challenge. Danny tested the crane controls, estimating angles and lift capacity. The extraction process took most of the morning. They had to clear debris from around the machine, position the truck precisely, and rig lifting straps in a configuration that would support the weight evenly. The crane groaned under the load as it lifted the machine, and for a moment Samuel worried that either the straps or the crane itself might fail. But Danny knew his equipment, and slowly, carefully, the engine rose from the ground where it had sat for decades. Rust particles rained down as the machine swung through the air, leaving a rust-colored dust cloud in its wake. They lowered it onto the flatbed with extreme care, the truck suspension compressing visibly under the weight. Danny secured it with chains, wrapping them around multiple points and ratcheting them tight. The machine was not going anywhere. Back at Samuel's workshop, they used a forklift to move the engine into the covered workspace, positioning it on heavy wooden blocks that kept it off the floor and allowed access from all angles. Samuel paid the men their agreed-upon fees, promising them bonuses if the machine proved to be something special. They departed satisfied, leaving Samuel alone with his mysterious acquisition. The real work began that afternoon. Samuel gathered his tools, wire brushes, scrapers, chemical rust removers, water, rags, and began the painstaking process of cleaning and documentation. He worked systematically, starting at one end and progressing inch by inch, photographing each section before and after cleaning, taking notes on anything that appeared significant. As hours turned to days, the machine slowly revealed its secrets. More manufacturers' markings emerged, including a complete serial number stamped into the engine block. Patent numbers appeared on various components. Most significantly, Samuel uncovered a metal plate that had been protected from the worst of the corrosion by its position beneath an overhang. When cleaned, it displayed crisp lettering, Electric Boat Company, Groton, Connecticut, followed by a designation, Model 10D38, main propulsion engine, and a date of manufacture, April 1943. Samuel photographed everything, his excitement growing with each discovery. He researched the model number, finding references in declassified naval documents to engines of this type being installed in Gato-class submarines, the workhorses of the American submarine fleet in the Pacific Theater during World War II. These engines, working in pairs, provided surface propulsion while also charging the massive battery banks that powered the electric motors used for submerged operations. But the most significant discovery came when Samuel cleaned a section near what would have been the front mounting point of the engine. Here, protected by a thick layer of grease that had hardened to a waxy consistency over the decades, he found another plate. This one bore not just manufacturing information but deployment data, a submarine designation. The letters emerged slowly as he worked away the protective coating, SS-247. Samuel immediately stopped working and moved to his computer. He searched for USS SS-247 and found himself reading about the USS Dace, a Gato-class submarine commissioned in July 1943. He pulled up the official naval history, scanning through deployment records, battle summaries, and technical specifications. The Dace had served with distinction in the Pacific, participating in multiple war patrols and sinking several Japanese vessels. But something else caught Samuel's attention as he dug deeper into the records. In September 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Dace had been involved in a collision while maneuvering to avoid depth charges. The submarine had sustained significant damage to its propulsion system, requiring emergency repairs at Fremantle, Australia. According to the official records, both main engines had been badly damaged, with one being completely replaced and the other extensively rebuilt. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. Could this be the damaged engine that had been removed from the Dace during those repairs? He searched for information about what happened to damaged or replaced submarine components during the war. The logistics were staggering. The Pacific theater was thousands of miles from American manufacturing centers, and shipping capacity was at a premium. Damaged equipment that could not be repaired locally was typically cataloged and stored, with the intention of eventual return to the United States for analysis, refurbishment, or, in some cases, disposal. Further research revealed that in the chaos of wartime logistics, not all equipment made it back to its intended destinations. Some pieces were lost in transit, others were diverted to different facilities as priorities shifted, and still others simply disappeared into the vast network of military depots and storage facilities that dotted the American landscape. An engine removed from a submarine in Australia in 1944 might have been shipped to any number of locations, particularly if it was bound for salvage rather than repair. Samuel created a timeline, piecing together information from multiple sources. The engine would have been removed in late 1944. Shipping back to the United States would have taken months, particularly given the priority assigned to moving personnel and critical supplies rather than damaged equipment. By the time the engine arrived stateside, probably sometime in 1945, the war in the Pacific was moving toward its conclusion. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the urgency of many military programs evaporated, and the focus shifted to demobilization and disposal of surplus equipment. The Naval Ammunition Depot near Tonopah had been one of hundreds of facilities designated for the storage and eventual disposal of surplus military equipment. It was not inconceivable that a damaged submarine engine, written off as scrap, would have ended up there. From the depot, it might have been sold as surplus to a civilian contractor, who stored it in the yard where Samuel eventually found it. The chain of custody was speculative, but plausible. Verification, however, required more than speculation. Samuel knew he needed expert confirmation that the engine truly was from the USS Dace and that it was indeed the engine removed during the 1944 repairs. He began reaching out to naval historians, submarine veterans organizations, and museum curators who specialized in World War II naval equipment. The responses came slowly at first, then with increasing frequency as word spread through the small community of naval history enthusiasts. A curator from the Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut expressed immediate interest, asking for detailed photographs and measurements. A retired naval engineer who had worked on diesel-electric submarines in the 1960s offered to examine the engine in person if Samuel would permit it. Most significantly, a historian who specialized in Gato-class submarines and had written extensively about the USS Dace contacted Samuel with information that seemed to confirm his hypothesis. The historian, Dr. Margaret Chen from the Naval History and Heritage Command, explained that she had been researching the USS Dace for a book and had come across references to the engine removal in Australian maintenance records. Those records indicated that the damaged engine had been marked for return to the United States with a designation code that matched records of equipment shipped to the Tonopah Depot. The trail had gone cold there, with no subsequent documentation of the engine's final disposition. It had simply vanished into the massive inventory of surplus equipment that flooded American military depots in the immediate aftermath of World War II. Dr. Chen traveled to Nevada to examine the engine in person, bringing with her a team of specialists including a metallurgist and mechanical engineer with expertise in vintage naval equipment. Their examination took 3 days, during which they photographed, measured, sampled, and documented every aspect of the machine. They compared serial numbers with records they had obtained from the naval archives. They analyzed the composition of the metal to confirm it matched specifications for submarine engines produced in the early 1940s. They examined wear patterns and damage consistent with the collision reported in the DACE's official history. Their conclusion, delivered on the 3rd day of examination, confirmed what Samuel had hoped. The engine was authentic. It was almost certainly the unit removed from the USS Dace in 1944, and it represented a significant piece of naval history that the academic community had assumed was lost forever. The implications extended beyond simple historical curiosity. The USS Dace had been involved in some of the most significant naval engagements of the Pacific War. The submarine had participated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of the largest naval battles in history, during which American submarines had decimated a Japanese carrier task force. The engine Samuel had discovered had powered the Dace during its war patrols, had been operating when the submarine stalked and sank enemy vessels, had been running when the collision occurred that damaged it so severely. More importantly, the engine's survival provided modern engineers and historians with an opportunity to study firsthand the technology that had given the United States a decisive advantage in the submarine war against Japan. While similar engines existed in museums, few retained the kind of documentation that this one had, and none had such a well-documented service history. The engine was not just a piece of machinery. It was a time capsule containing engineering solutions, manufacturing techniques, and operational characteristics that could inform current understanding of World War II submarine operations. News of the discovery spread rapidly through naval history circles and eventually reached mainstream media. Samuel found himself giving interviews, hosting visitors, and fielding inquiries from institutions interested in acquiring or displaying the engine. The Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut expressed strong interest in adding it to their collection. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans made an offer. Even the Australian War Memorial inquired, given the engine's connection to repairs conducted at Fremantle. The Navy itself took notice. Representatives from the Naval History and Heritage Command visited Samuel's workshop, verifying the engine's authenticity and exploring whether it should be formally recognized as a naval artifact. The question of ownership proved complex. The engine had been written off as scrap decades ago, had passed through multiple hands, and had been purchased by Samuel in good faith from what appeared to be abandoned property. After considerable legal review, the Navy determined that Samuel held clear title to the engine but requested that, should he decide to sell it, he give preference to institutions that would preserve it for public benefit. Samuel found himself in an unusual position. What he had purchased for its scrap value, perhaps $300 or $400 worth of metal, had transformed into an artifact worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars to the right buyer. More than the monetary value, however, he found himself invested in the engine's story and in ensuring it ended up somewhere that would honor its history and make it accessible to people who cared about such things. He spent weeks considering his options, discussing possibilities with Dr. Chen and other historians, touring museums, and evaluating proposals. The decision came down to a choice between maximum financial return and optimal historical preservation. The highest monetary offers came from private collectors, individuals with the resources to acquire significant military artifacts for personal collections. The most compelling curatorial proposals came from public institutions with limited acquisition budgets but strong educational missions. Samuel had spent his entire adult life as a prospector and scrapper, someone who made his living finding value where others saw waste. The discovery of the submarine engine represented the apex of that career, the find that every scrapper dreams of but rarely encounters. Yet as he stood in his workshop, looking at the massive machine that had emerged from decades of neglect, he found his thinking shaped less by financial considerations than by questions of legacy and stewardship. The engine had survived against considerable odds. It had been damaged in combat, removed and shipped thousands of miles, stored and forgotten, sold as surplus, abandoned, corroded by decades of exposure, and finally discovered by a prospector who happened to look under a tarp that dozens of other scavengers had ignored. That chain of improbable events had preserved something significant, and Samuel felt a responsibility to honor that preservation by making the right decision about the engine's future. His choice, when he finally made it, reflected those considerations. He donated the engine to the Submarine Force Museum in Connecticut, with several conditions. First, that it be restored and displayed prominently with full documentation of its history and discovery. Second, that educational materials be developed around it to help visitors understand not just the engine itself but the broader story of submarine warfare in the Pacific. Third, that he retain the right to tell his story of discovering it, so that people would understand that history still surfaces in unexpected places, waiting to be found by those who look carefully. The museum agreed enthusiastically to all conditions. Arrangements were made for professional transportation of the engine across the country. Conservation specialists began planning the restoration work required to stabilize the metal, preserve what remained of original finishes, and prepare the engine for long-term display. Educational specialists started developing curriculum materials that would use the engine as a focal point for lessons about World War II naval history, engineering evolution, and the importance of historical preservation. Before the engine left his workshop, Samuel spent a final day with it, documenting his personal connection to the discovery and recording his thoughts about the improbable journey that had brought this particular piece of history back to light. He thought about the submariners who had served aboard the USS Dace, young men who had gone to war in vessels that represented the cutting edge of naval technology. He thought about the engineers who had designed and built the engine, craftsmen who had poured their knowledge and skill into creating machines that would perform reliably under the most demanding conditions imaginable. He thought about all the people whose decisions or accidents or oversights had resulted in this engine ending up in a Nevada scrapyard rather than being destroyed or forgotten. Most of all, he thought about the nature of discovery itself, about how history persists in unexpected forms and places, waiting to be recognized and valued. He had spent 43 years searching the desert for treasures, usually finding just enough to sustain his simple lifestyle. This one discovery had yielded something beyond monetary value. It had connected him to a larger story, had made him part of the ongoing effort to preserve and understand the past. The engine departed for Connecticut on a humid morning, secured to a specialized trailer designed for transporting large artifacts. Samuel watched it roll down his driveway and onto the highway, beginning the journey that would return it to the state where it had been manufactured 8 decades earlier. He felt satisfied, though also a bit melancholy, seeing something that had consumed his attention for months finally moving beyond his control. In the weeks that followed, Samuel found himself reflecting on what the discovery meant beyond the immediate facts of finding and preserving a historically significant artifact. He had spent his entire career as someone operating on the margins of society, a scrapper viewed by many as existing at the bottom of the economic ladder, someone who made his living from society's discards. Yet it was precisely that position, that willingness to see value where others saw only waste, that had led to the engine's discovery. The official unveiling of the restored engine at the Submarine Force Museum took place on a cold November morning, deliberately scheduled to coincide with Veterans Day observances. Samuel traveled to Connecticut for the event, one of several honored guests that included surviving veterans of the USS Dace, descendants of crew members who had not survived the war, and scholars who had studied the submarine's history. The engine occupied a central position in a new exhibit space, beautifully lit, with interpretive panels explaining its history, its technology, and its discovery. During the ceremony, the museum director spoke about the engine's journey from wartime service to Australian repair facility to Nevada scrapyard to final preservation. She emphasized that without Samuel's curiosity and persistence, this artifact would have been lost, likely cut up and recycled without anyone knowing what it actually represented. She presented him with a plaque recognizing his role in preserving naval history. Samuel accepted the recognition with characteristic modesty, but when given an opportunity to speak, he took it. He talked about the importance of looking carefully at the world, of not assuming that what appears worthless actually is. He spoke about how history surrounds us in forms we often fail to recognize, and how preservation depends on ordinary people making choices to value and protect things that others might discard. He encouraged the audience to look beyond surface appearances, to investigate what might lie beneath rust and neglect, and to consider that significance often hides in unexpected places. The response to the engine's preservation and display exceeded the museum's expectations. Attendance increased substantially, with many visitors specifically requesting to see the Dace engine. Educational groups incorporated it into curricula. Media coverage generated renewed interest in the submarine war in the Pacific, leading to increased attention for other preservation efforts and for veterans organizations. The story of how an old prospector had found the engine by looking under a tarp resonated with people, reminding them that discovery was still possible, that history was not just something locked away in official repositories, but something that still surfaced in the world, waiting to be recognized. For Samuel, life returned largely to its previous patterns. He continued working as a scrapper, continued searching through abandoned places for things that might have value. He never found another artifact of comparable significance, though he remained alert to the possibility. The discovery had changed him in subtle ways. He approached his work with renewed attention to documentation and research, taking more care to understand what he found rather than simply assessing scrap value. He developed relationships with local historical societies and museums, becoming someone they consulted when questions arose about industrial or military artifacts from the region. The story of the submarine engine became something Samuel told to anyone who would listen, not out of ego but out of a genuine desire to encourage people to look carefully at the world around them. He spoke at schools, gave interviews to historians, participated in documentaries about World War II technology. He became, unexpectedly, an advocate for historical preservation and for the role that ordinary citizens could play in protecting and valuing the past. Years after the initial discovery, Samuel received a letter from a woman who identified herself as the granddaughter of a sailor who had served aboard the USS Dace during its war patrols. She explained that her grandfather had died when she was young, and she had grown up knowing little about his wartime service. Visiting the Submarine Force Museum and seeing the engine, reading about its history and its improbable preservation, had given her a tangible connection to her grandfather's experience. She thanked Samuel for caring enough to preserve the engine rather than simply scrapping it for its metal value. That letter, more than any financial gain or public recognition, validated the choice Samuel had made. History, he had learned, was not merely about facts and dates and official records. It was about connections, about helping people understand their place in larger stories, about preserving physical evidence of past experiences so that future generations could touch something real, something that had been present during significant events. The submarine engine that Samuel Brennan pulled from beneath a sun-faded tarp in a Nevada scrapyard had traveled an improbable path. Manufactured in Connecticut, installed in a submarine that fought across the Pacific, damaged in combat, removed in Australia, shipped to Nevada, abandoned, forgotten, discovered, preserved, and finally displayed where thousands of people could see it and understand something of its significance. That journey represented not just the history of a single artifact, but a reminder that history itself is fragile, dependent on chains of circumstances and choices that determine what survives and what disappears. Samuel understood that he had been merely one link in that chain, someone who happened to be in the right place with the right combination of curiosity and persistence to recognize what lay beneath the rust. But he also understood that such moments of recognition mattered, that the decision to investigate rather than ignore, to preserve rather than destroy, could mean the difference between history's survival and its loss. As Samuel grew older, the story of the submarine engine took on additional significance. It became the defining achievement of his career, the discovery that transformed him from simply another scrapper into someone who had contributed meaningfully to historical preservation. Young people interested in history or engineering or military service sought him out, wanting to hear firsthand about the discovery. Journalists revisited the story on anniversaries. The museum featured him in promotional materials, the old prospector whose curiosity had rescued a piece of naval history. Through it all, Samuel remained remarkably unchanged, still living modestly, still working the scrapyards and abandoned places of Nevada, still looking for value in what others discarded. The submarine engine had brought him recognition and satisfaction, but it had not fundamentally altered who he was or what he valued. If anything, it had confirmed what he had always believed, that careful attention, persistence, and willingness to look beyond surface appearances could reveal remarkable things. The engine itself continued to inspire discovery and learning long after its initial preservation. Engineers studied its construction techniques, finding solutions to design challenges that remained relevant to modern machinery. Historians used it as a focal point for research into submarine operations, uncovering additional details about the USS Dasa service and the broader campaign in the Pacific. Educators built lessons around it that taught not just history but also chemistry, physics, and materials science. Veterans and their families visited it, finding in its massive presence a tangible reminder of service and sacrifice. Before we wrap up this incredible story, I want to remind you one more time, we're so close to hitting 7,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history and discovery, please hit that subscribe button. And if you want to support the channel even more, consider leaving a super thanks. Every contribution helps us research and create more of these fascinating stories. Don't forget to comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love building this global community of history enthusiasts together. Samuel Brennan's discovery of a lost World War II submarine engine beneath a tarp in an abandoned scrapyard stood as testimony to several interconnected truths. It demonstrated that history remained accessible, not locked away in archives but physically present in the world, waiting to be found. It showed that ordinary people making everyday choices could have extraordinary impact on historical preservation. It proved that value existed in unexpected forms and places, and that recognition of that value required attention, knowledge, and care. The massive diesel engine, once destined for the recycling furnace, instead found permanent home in a museum where it would educate and inspire generations to come. Samuel Brennan, the old prospector who saw beyond the rust and recognized significance, had given history a gift, the preservation of an artifact that might otherwise have vanished forever. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone who heard the story that discovery remained possible, that history still surfaced in unexpected places, and that anyone with curiosity and persistence might find themselves the custodian of something remarkable, waiting beneath a sun-faded tarp for someone to look carefully and recognize what truly lay beneath.